Machiavelli's name is synonymous with ruthlessness, trickery, and cunning. When we hear Machiavelli's name, we think Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones, or that friend of ours who never buys a pint when it's there round. But how true is this characterization of Machiavelli's own writings? We'll see that Machiavelli admired bold action, effective military force, and deception when necessary. But what many people don't realize is that Machiavelli was a Republican who thought that liberty was best preserved when power was placed in the hands of the people. My name's James Muldoon, I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Exeter, and this is an introduction to Machiavelli. If you're new to Machiavelli and need some context, this is a great place to start. For more analysis of his political theory, check out my other videos, and don't forget to subscribe for more political philosophy. Education and career. Machiavelli was born into a well-respected middle-class family in Florence on 3rd of May 1479 during the Italian Renaissance. He received an excellent education in Latin, rhetoric, moral philosophy, and ancient history. He was trained to imitate the style of classical writers such as Cicero. It was this kind of training that was seen as the best preparation for political life. Today it seems like you need 5 years' experience even to get an entry-level job, but when Machiavelli was 29, he was appointed as a senior administrator within the Republic of Florence, and his main duties concerned foreign affairs. Machiavelli was sent on over 40 missions in his 12 years in office, and remember this is 500 years before Ryanair started offering £20 flights. Machiavelli was a keen observer of other politicians and wrote back Gossip Girl-style letters to the Republic of Florence concerning all of the queen bees, it girls, and frenemies of European politics. Some of these insights appear almost word for word in his most famous book, The Prince. On these missions, Machiavelli learnt the importance of the art of appearances. Those who succeeded in his eyes were those who could become masters of manipulation. One of Machiavelli's most important missions was when he was sent to check out a new rising star of Italian politics, Duke Cesare Borgia. Borgia was appointed Duke by his father, Pope Alexander VI. It turns out getting a job isn't that hard when your dad is the Pope. Borgia begins a series of military campaigns across the Italian peninsula which start to threaten Florence's interests. Machiavelli is sent to check him out. Machiavelli's first letters back sound like a fan who's met Beyoncé for the first time. The Duke, with his unheard of good fortune, with a courage and confidence almost superhuman, and believing himself capable of accomplishing whatever he undertakes, he's incredible. Machiavelli is full of praise for the Duke. The Duke possesses many of the characteristics that Machiavelli will admire in a leader: boldness, cunning, ruthlessness, use of deception when necessary. This explains why Machiavelli gives him such a glowing review in chapters 7 and 8 of The Prince. But soon Machiavelli realizes that the Duke has relied too much on his good fortune and support from his father. When his father, who is the Pope, remember, passes away, the Duke's fortunes start to change. The first issue was in Borgia's support of a new Pope. He promised to support Cardinal Rivera on the condition that the Duke would be put in charge of Rivera's armies once he was appointed Pope. The problem with this approach was that Cardinal Rivera held a huge grudge against the Duke due to being exiled by his father while his father was the Pope. Rivera deceived Borgia into supporting him, having no intention of putting Borgia in charge of the armies once he was elected. While Borgia was a master of deception himself, in this instance Machiavelli thought that he had allowed himself to be deceived. The Prince. Machiavelli wrote his most famous book, The Prince, basically during his retirement. In 1512, Florence found itself attacked by Spanish forces backed by the Pope. The exiled Medici family returned, and the Republic collapsed. This meant Machiavelli lost his position and was soon imprisoned and tortured due to the suspicion that he was involved in a plot against the Medicis. Once he was free, Machiavelli started thinking about ways he could endear himself to the new rulers of Florence. He had worked for 14 years as a diplomat and thought there was some way he could show his wisdom and expertise to the Medicis. Most of the book concerns how a new prince can gain and hold new territory. Coincidentally, the very same position the Medici family finds themselves in. Machiavelli even gives a copy of the book to his friend, asking him to personally give it to Lorenzo Medici. Desiring therefore to present myself to you, to your magnificence, with some testimony of my devotion towards you, I have not found among my possessions anything which I hold more dear than or value so much as the knowledge of the actions of great men, acquired by long experience in contemporary affairs and a study, nay, a continual study of antiquity. Blah, 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 which I now send to you, digested into a little volume to your magnificence. Machiavelli's text is written in the style of a popular genre at the time called Mirrors of Princes. It's a kind of self-help book for rulers on how to govern. It's the kind of book you might give your little cousin if they're about to take over a new kingdom and you're worried they're still angry at you for eating the last slice of pizza at the last family gathering. But while Machiavelli's text is written in this style, its fundamental lessons subvert the typical advice offered in such books. Writers in 15th century Italy followed the Roman moralists in advising new princes that they should follow the 4 cardinal virtues of justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. But most importantly, and this is Cicero's advice, a prince should be honest at all times with all people. Machiavelli argued that a new ruler would need to lie and kill to maintain effective control. Moral goodness was not in itself sufficient to be an effective politician. Machiavelli rejected the structured and hierarchical world of classical political philosophy. He advised new princes that they lived in a world of constant flux and that they'd need to be flexible and adapt themselves to suit the circumstances. Success would come to those who were able to suit the spirit of their times. Fortune would determine half their fate, but the other half was in their hands. For Machiavelli, the ultimate goal of the prince was to achieve honor and glory by uniting the Italian peninsula through the creation of a strong and stable state. Machiavelli lived through a time of great instability and division, where small Italian powers were at the mercy of larger nation-states in Europe. Machiavelli was an Italian patriot who longed for a time in which a united Italy would be able to defend itself from incursions against these foreign powers. His entire political thought is oriented by a desire for a united Italy and eventually an Italian republic. The Discourses on Livy. Given how much people focus on the prince, it can be easy to forget that Machiavelli wrote a second text, arguably more important, called the Discourses on Livy. The text is a commentary on the first 10 books of Livy's The History of Rome. It's an attempt to understand the sources of Rome's greatness in order to draw lessons for the present. The text can be difficult to follow, but just as the prince sought to show rulers how to govern, the Discourses seek to show how a city can obtain power and greatness. Machiavelli writes about a number of republics in the Discourses, but he holds none in as high regard as the Roman Republic, and he gives one principal reason for its greatness. Experience shows that cities have never increased in dominion except while at liberty. In this book, Machiavelli prefers republics to principalities. He thinks that a republic will be more likely to be oriented towards the common good. A prince will be likely to enrich themselves at the expense of the public. Just think of any 20th century dictator. Every republic is upheld by the virtue of its citizens, but it has a natural tendency towards corruption over time. Corruption is when citizens start caring more about their own private interests than the common good. It's a strange idea for modern liberals because so much of our lives are oriented towards private concerns. Machiavelli would be very critical of how much of our lives are actually devoted towards the pursuit of private pleasure over service to the public. The question that Machiavelli asks in this text is, how do you maintain citizens' virtues over time? How do you keep people oriented towards the common good? The first thing that Machiavelli addresses is the importance of a city's foundation. Without strong foundations, it's going to be very hard for a city to achieve greatness. And here he thinks that one person is better than the many for founding a new city. He doesn't want the vision to get watered down by a committee all throwing their ideas together. Here we see an old figure of political philosophy, the lawgiver, someone, usually a foreigner, who comes to give new laws to a city, to establish it on a new foundation. But a city won't last long if it rests on the shoulders of one person. That's why Machiavelli thinks that strong republican institutions will be needed to preserve a city over time. There were 2 institutions that Machiavelli thought were important. The first was a civic religion, something that would instill discipline in citizens and keep them oriented towards the public good. The second was good laws, and in particular Machiavelli thought something called a mixed constitution would be the best kind of republic. A mixed constitution was a regime with a mixture of democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy. Machiavelli thought that the pure form of any of these three regimes would actually lead to instability and corruption. Most classical republicans would have assented to these ideas, but Machiavelli adds a number of novel elements to the mix. Instead of emphasizing harmony and balance between social orders, Machiavelli asserts that it was in fact conflict and competition that led to Rome's greatness. He thought that class conflict between the patrician and the plebeian class, or between the few and the many, was actually a productive conflict, which allowed the many to actually check the tendencies of the few to dominate the city. Machiavelli had particular praise for an institution in Rome called the Tribune of the Plebs, and actually overemphasized its historical importance as a way of directing our attention towards it. This was an institution that was open to ordinary citizens that could propose new legislation, intervene in legal matters, and actually veto actions of the magistrates. Another innovation of Machiavelli was that instead of keeping a republic in a self-contained city-state, he thought that it was actually through military expansionism that Rome achieved its greatness. Machiavelli credits Romulus, Rome's first lawgiver, with the institutions that were well suited to military expansion. He advocated a policy of imperial conquest abroad in order to preserve freedom at home. Machiavelli put forward a new kind of republicanism that drew on classical writers but created something entirely new in the process. Machiavelli's Pragmatism. There are a number of important similarities across Machiavelli's writings. In both The Prince and the Discourses, Machiavelli offers a very bleak and pessimistic view of human nature, emphasizing our frailty and capriciousness. But at the same time, Machiavelli sees human beings as capable of greatness, both on an individual level through heroic action, but also on the level of the collective, through the institutional framework of a republic. Machiavelli's pragmatic advice to new rulers was to advise them that their rivals could be duplicitous and could deceive them, but he believed that ordinary citizens rather than the nobility would be the most trustworthy, the most reliable, and would be the best defenders of liberty. Machiavelli assumed that human appetite was essentially insatiable, but it was only the nobility that possessed an essential desire to dominate others, rather than simply a desire not to be dominated themselves. Machiavelli was a committed Republican, Florentine, and Italian patriot. He served the Republic loyally for 15 years, and his entire political theory is about how to create a strong and unified Italy. Machiavelli was a political realist who admired certain rulers whose actions we might see today as reprehensible. But it's hard to ignore some of his advice, that we should be cautious about our rivals and that we should take precautions both against fate and against the actions of others. For a more in-depth analysis of The Prince, the Discourses, and for more discussion of his political theory, check out my other videos. And don't forget to subscribe for more political philosophy.